closing arguments are underway right now in the sex trafficking trial for Sean Diddy Combs. The music mogul is accused of using his fame and fortune to run a criminal enterprise involving coercion, violence, and sex trafficking. But his attorneys say that this was perhaps domestic violence, but it was not racketeering. Now, throughout the trial, jurors in this case heard from several of Combs's former girlfriends. They testified that at some point or another, they felt forced to engage in so-called freak-offs or hotel nights that would often last for days. And right now, the federal government is sharing their case with this jury, their final presentation, before, of course, their rebuttal. But let's check in on the ground with our legal correspondent who has been there from the beginning of this case. Kelly Craft is joining us now. Kelly, tell us what you know about closings. We don't have cameras there, so we're getting the details from you, from Julie Grant, who joined us earlier, about how closings are going.
Well, good afternoon to you, Julia. So on a lunch break right now here in Lower Manhattan, court is going to get back underway in about 15 minutes. So those closing arguments will resume. The prosecution is going. They started this morning about 10:15, outlining each and every charge, starting with that racketeering conspiracy, describing what elements are needed and how the evidence they put forth in this case satisfies each and every element. Right before we broke for lunch, they began talking about sex trafficking. And one of the things they discussed is how could we see women that are coming up here saying that they were willing to have sex with multiple men, and they did so because they wanted to make Sean Diddy Combs happy. How is that sex trafficking? Well, the prosecutor pointed to one specific night in June in particular in which she said, the woman who's going by the name of Jane throughout this trial, said that she didn't want to participate in a hotel night, but she explained the evidence showed that Sean Combs beat her. He choked her, and he told her, "You're not going to ruin my night." And then he made her take part in a hotel night. The prosecutor said that is sex trafficking. Why don't we go ahead and put up some information we have for you from some of the closing argument that did take place this morning. We built some full screens out because, of course, this is federal court, and so we don't have cameras inside. But some of the things that the prosecutor said during closing, he doesn't take no for an answer. And as she started the government's closing argument, she quoted Combs' former assistant Brendan Paul, saying the defendant used power, violence, and fear to get what he wanted. We also have another full screen that we can put up for you. The Assistant U.S. Attorney, Christy Slavek, she recalled two incidents 8 years apart. She said Combs' hotel attack on Cassie Ventura in 2016, as well as his 2024 assault on Jane in her home. They're not separate stories, she said. They're chapters in the same book. The story of Sean Combs and the criminal enterprise he led, made up of his inner circle. So really compelling closing argument so far, Julia, by the federal prosecutor. I also just want to describe the scene out here. We have seen more people. The first day of the case, we saw a lot of people. We are seeing more and more people today. They've opened up 4 overflow rooms inside that federal courthouse. At one point in time throughout the morning, each has been fully packed. So quite a chaotic scene. We've also had separate groups out here giving news conferences. One is called Safe Horizon. They just did a news conference out here, and they were supporting the victims that testified in this case. The woman I spoke to, named Liz, said that she came out with her group to say, we stand with the victims who came forward for their bravery, and she said, we do not like how defense counsel has been painting the victims at all, and that's understandable because of the group that they represent. But Julia, that's what's been going on here. Again, the closing arguments are going to resume in about 15 more minutes, and we'll be in there and bring you all the details as they become available.
Kelly, can you give us a little information about the verdict forms? I know there were 2 competing verdict forms that each side had, and that racketeering one is the most convoluted, I would say, because of all of those predicate acts underneath. And can you just touch on some of the predicate acts that these jurors have to agree are part of the case, and if so, then they can find him guilty of racketeering?
So, Julia, great question, because when we talk about racketeering conspiracy, it's very complicated. And even as the judge has described it, you know, you have horizontal lines, you have vertical lines, and everything's got to tie together neatly. So there are several allegations that the prosecutor has put forth that you would need to satisfy. You need to satisfy 2 predicate acts in order to get to that racketeering conspiracy charge. So, for instance, bribery, drug trafficking. They would only need to have those two, for instance, to then establish a guilty verdict on that racketeering conspiracy. But there are also other ones in there, the sex trafficking, as well as arson. So I know there was some confusion yesterday in regard to the streamlining of the case by the prosecutors. They got rid of the allegations of attempted arson, attempted kidnapping. They still kept arson, though, as well as kidnapping. And so they're still talking about the Kid Cudi incident in which his Porsche was torched. So again, Julia, when they're taking a look at that entire verdict form, they're going to see, well, did the elements satisfy these things, these predicate acts, these allegations under racketeering? So bribery could be one, drug trafficking could be one. Before we also broke for break, they were talking about the sex trafficking, before that the drug trafficking, and really explaining to the jurors that Sean Combs telling someone, I want some drugs, that person giving Sean Combs or someone else the drugs, and then that person giving another person the drugs for a girl to take, that's drug distribution, drug trafficking. So really just laying out how they have met every single element in this case that they have charged him with, according to the prosecutors.
Prosecution today, defense tomorrow. Kelly Craft, thank you so much for that update. We'll be checking in with you throughout the day. And we're turning our attention now because there's been so much attention on the outcome of the Sean Diddy Combs trial, but there's also been a lot of comparisons to another high-profile trial. Even prosecutors in the Diddy courtroom made reference to music mogul R. Kelly's federal sex trafficking RICO trial from 2021. You'll recall that the I Believe I Can Fly singer was convicted by a New York jury and is now serving a 30-year sentence for that. So we have here a very special guest to discuss how these cases match up, if at all. Someone who knows exactly what it's like to defend a music star in this type of trial. We have trial attorney Thomas Farinella with us. Thomas, thank you for being here and joining us to talk about this case. You represented Robert Sylvester Kelly in his 2021 RICO trial. It was many weeks long, like this one. I was inside of that courtroom for that case, so I saw firsthand you defending your client. I want to know what your reaction was to this indictment 4 years after your client went to trial and was convicted. Diddy's attorney said this is the first time no one has ever been treated under these laws like our client has. But I wonder if you agree with that, or would you say that your client was the first to use RICO or to have RICO used against him like this?
Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here. So with that being said, the first RICO case that was brought regarding sex and sex trafficking was obviously the NXIVM case. That was probably a test case. Robert Kelly's case, was really the first RICO case that was commenced against an individual. And Robert Kelly was actually the entire enterprise. So it was quite unique. The government had never commenced a RICO case along these lines before. And it's been quite highlighted that after the fact that, you know, this very unique set of facts were actually tried and the government was successful. So I would say that Robert's case was really the first case. And during the trial, I often argued that if in fact this was going to be able to happen to Robert, that gives the government carte blanche to go after whomever else they wish to go after. And here we are.
Here we are indeed. I want to know what you think about whether or not this case that the prosecution is bringing against Sean Diddy Combs is stronger from a defense point, or if it's weaker, or if you think that this was an overreach in terms of the RICO used in the Diddy Combs case.
Well, so there's a lot of similarities. There's a couple of distinctions. In this case, the main distinction obviously is the drugs and the arson. The bribery, there was also witness intimidation in Robert's case, and then obviously the Aaliyah issues. But so in this particular case, you know, they're very similar. But more importantly, you see, the problem is that they are essentially criminalizing normal behavior, right? Everyday normal behavior, consenting sexual adult relationships. And I said this even during Robert's case. And so it's very difficult for the jury to delineate. So it's going to be very important for the defense to have a closing argument that keeps the jurors engaged and and allows them to pay attention to the fact that this is behavior that was consenting and adult. behavior that was, and so, I think it's important to highlight the differences, but it's also important to highlight the similarities.
Now, I want to dig into that, Thomas, because you say normal behavior. And though I think the defense did something a bit different than I noticed that you all did in the 2021 trials, that they accepted a lot of the problems with the case. They acquiesced to domestic violence, to him being a terrible person, to there being these situations. This violence that we are hearing about and seeing, I think it's going to be hard for the jury to find that as normal. Would you say that that was one of the most challenging parts, was to normalize some of this behavior for a jury in New York?
And as a lawyer, I should have probably chose my words a little bit better. And when I mean normal, I mean behavior that is not illegal in terms of, it's the underlying actions. Now, the domestic assault is not normal behavior. It's unacceptable. And I think the defense came out, they conceded it, and you have to just get it out there and put it behind you. And I think they're going to have to spend some time on that in the closing, saying, we don't advocate this. We don't support this. Don't take this as some sort of a cheerleader type of thing. But the reality is, when it comes to this very unique behavior, I'll say, it is, at the end of the day, adult consenting sexual relationships that the government is trying to criminalize. And the same thing happened in Robert's case. And there's so many similarities in the sense that there were witnesses in Robert's case that said that they were going to be promised certain things if they stayed with him. There was an incentive. I mean, there were incentives, and there were items purchased for these people, and there was a lifestyle. And I think Don Hughes testified, I know in Robert's case, to this the financial abuse, because they're dependent on this person, the enterprise, or the person who's at the head of this. And so financially dependent, they would be able to be financially manipulated. These things have to be addressed piece by piece. I sat in Robert's courtroom for 6 weeks. The closing argument that the government gave started at 1:53, ended at 5:30 on the first day. Then on the second day we started court, I believe it was 9 or 9:30. I'm looking at my notes. They went all the way to the lunch break. So that's another very interesting aspect in this case, is that the government had hours, much more time to make their closing argument than they did in this case, in Robert's case.
That's true. 4-hour limitation this time around, and yes, that was a lengthy closing argument. I want to ask your opinion, knowing what you know from that trial and looking at what these jurors are going to be weighing in this trial. Do you think this jury is going to convict Diddy, or do you think they may acquit him?
It's going to depend on the closing argument. It's going to depend on what the jury hears. See, and the defense has, and the reason why I mentioned the length of the closing argument in Robert's case versus this case is because the defense and the government and the defense will have about the same amount of time. The jurors, after a 6-week-long jury being inside the courtroom, and we actually were doing it during COVID, so it was even more restrictive, masks and all this other stuff. 6 long weeks sitting there paying attention day in and day out. And then they had an 8-hour closing argument from the government. And I believe that our closing went maybe through the afternoon. And then the government came back with, I think, a 4-hour rebuttal the next day. So, these are very critical. This is the most critical time in the case because the jurors are tired, and they're exhausted, and they're at the end of this line. So you want to make, it has to be very clear to them what it is that, from the government's perspective, that the government is saying Diddy did versus what he didn't do. And it's very important for the defense to really remind the jurors of what they were promised at the beginning, and were they given the reward that the government promised them.
Real quick, Thomas, before I know we have to let you go, and it's been illuminating to have you discuss this case, especially while we are in these closing arguments. Tell us just real quick what the status of Robert Kelly's appeal is. I know you were working on that at one point. I don't know if there has been a decision on it, but if Sean Diddy Combs is acquitted of this, do you think that impacts Robert Kelly's case, if at all?
So new counsel came in for the appeal, but nevertheless, with the Second Circuit decision is a very difficult decision that was used a lot in Diddy's case, in pretrial motions and things of that nature. Now, I'm not so certain if Diddy is acquitted, it would help Robert to the extent that it will establish anything. Remember, Robert has 2 cases in 2 separate jurisdictions, and so it's a little bit more complicated. However, with that being said, if in fact he's convicted, the Second Circuit decision in Robert's case really makes it a difficult appeal.
All right, Thomas Farinella, thank you for your time and for sharing that information with us. Hopefully we will see you perhaps once we get a verdict in the Sean Diddy Combs' case. Take care.